By 1962, the geopolitical board was dangerously unbalanced. The United States had positioned nuclear Jupiter missiles in Turkey, aiming directly at the Soviet Union. In response, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to level the playing field by quietly shipping ballistic missiles to a new ally, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy received this U-2 spy plane photograph. It shows military tents and 6 missile trailers clustered in a Cuban field, providing undeniable proof of a secret Soviet buildup. These were medium and intermediate-range ballistic weapons, capable of hitting a massive portion of the continental United States. If launched, they would detonate over American cities within minutes, leaving the military with nearly zero time to organize a response. With a few pieces of photographic film, the long, simmering tension of the Cold War suddenly collapsed into a direct countdown to global nuclear conflict. Kennedy immediately pulled together the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, a group known as XCOM. The initial meetings inside the cabinet room were deeply chaotic, as advisors scrambled to process the reality of the threat. The military leadership presented the president with 2 strict kinetic options. Option A was a surgical airstrike to bomb the missile sites. Option B was a massive, full-scale military invasion of Cuba to dismantle Fidel Castro's regime. To Cold War hawks like Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, anything short of overwhelming force was a dangerous concession. They argued that a limited strike might miss mobile launchers and that a weak response would invite further Soviet aggression. But Kennedy realized both military paths were traps. Attacking a Soviet installation in Cuba, whether from the air or by land, would virtually guarantee a massive Soviet retaliation, either against the isolated city of Berlin or through a nuclear launch. Choosing either military option meant losing control of the escalation ladder entirely. The president was already highly skeptical of simple, aggressive solutions. A year earlier, he had relied on military intelligence for the Bay of Pigs invasion, a disaster that left him wary of letting his generals dictate complex geopolitical strategy. Instead of committing immediately to an irreversible attack, Kennedy demanded a flexible response. He needed a maneuver that would project strength without firing the first shot. This map illustrates the geographical solution the administration devised, a naval blockade. By positioning ships in a ring around the island, the U.S. could physically intercept and halt the delivery of any further Soviet weapons. There was a massive legal hurdle, though. Under international law, declaring a blockade is an active, formal declaration of war. If the U.S. used that specific terminology, the Soviet Union would be legally compelled to respond with immediate military force, so they changed the label. They called it a quarantine. By framing the maneuver as a firm public health measure, the U.S. avoided an automatic act of war. It gave Soviet ships an explicit off-ramp, a chance to simply turn around without losing face. The goal of the quarantine was never to defeat the Soviet military at sea. It was a mechanism designed entirely to pause the physical momentum of the crisis, freezing the board to buy time for diplomacy.
Kennedy announced the quarantine to the public on October 22nd. Within days, U.S. naval forces moved into position across the Atlantic to intercept incoming traffic. To ensure the military didn't force his hand, Kennedy issued incredibly strict rules of engagement. Naval commanders were ordered not to fire without direct, explicit permission from the White House, keeping total control of the engagement strictly in the Oval Office. But the Soviet supply ships kept steaming toward the line. The world watched, as the 2 fleets physically closed the distance in the middle of the ocean. The standoff pushed both superpowers to their absolute limit. Global military forces were placed on their highest possible alert state, waiting for a spark. Control was slipping.
In the heat of the standoff, a U-2 pilot strayed into Soviet airspace and was nearly shot down, while naval commanders were forced to make split-second decisions without word from Washington. At that moment, the survival of the planet rested on the personal restraint of individuals at the end of the chain of command. Yet, the line held. By choosing a middle course instead of immediate airstrikes, the U.S. successfully halted the physical conflict just long enough to activate a quiet, secondary layer of problem-solving. Behind closed doors, away from the military posturing, a diplomatic channel opened. Attorney General Robert Kennedy held a clandestine meeting with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin.
Together, they hammered out a compromise. The primary, highly publicized agreement was simple. The Soviet Union would dismantle and remove all nuclear weapons from Cuba under UN verification. In exchange, the United States made its own public concession, formally pledging that the U.S. military would not invade Cuba to overthrow Castro. This diagram illustrates the hidden trade that ultimately settled the crisis. Away from the cameras, the United States agreed to remove its aging Jupiter missiles from Turkey, restoring the strategic balance without a public loss of face. Keeping the Turkey concession strictly off the books was vital. It allowed both leaders to save face. Khrushchev got the missiles out of Europe, and Kennedy avoided the political humiliation of looking like he traded away an American advantage under pressure. Those 13 days forced a shift in how the superpowers handled the nuclear age. Within months, the White House and Kremlin established a direct hotline for instant communication and began negotiating the first treaties to limit nuclear testing. The optics of the deal, however, carried severe consequences for Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Domestically, the resolution was perceived as a humiliating retreat, heavily contributing to his removal from power 2 years later. Back in Washington, the reaction was split. General LeMay bluntly called the resolution the worst defeat in American history. Kennedy viewed it as a triumph of measured, flexible strategy over rigid aggression. When faced with an impossible binary, Kennedy refused to play the game on those terms. By resisting the loudest voices demanding overwhelming violence, he manufactured the time and space necessary to invent a diplomatic solution.